All right, good evening. I'm going to call this April 3rd Sammamish Planning Commission meeting to order. Start out with roll call. Hisham Elkawad.
Here.
Syed Safavian.
Here.
Ajay Chakrapani.
Here.
I'm Mark Boffman, and I'm here. Mike Bresco.
Here.
John Bachman.
Here.
Suda has an excused absence this evening. Next is agenda or meeting minutes. Agenda. Anybody have any adjustments they want to make to the agenda? Okay. How about approval of the minutes from our March 6th meeting? Any changes to the March 6th meeting minutes? Okay, no changes, so I'll call those approved. Public comment. I want to make a mention here that we've changed our public comment process a bit. So there's one person here who gets to hear this, but we've changed to align with the city council. So we have one public comment period for agenda and non-agenda comments, and it's 3 minutes per person. And then, of course, there's always public comment that goes with any public hearing. But that's been changed in the agenda, and I want to just point that out. Okay, so let's do public comment. Anybody want to make public comment?
Sure. The inaugural first under the new system. Hello, Planning Commissioners, Paul Stickney, Sammamish. I've got a related shotgun topic tonight of several topics along the lines of things I've been sending in over time. The two engines in Sammamish for housing needs over time are 23,000 households that live in the households here and 7,000 workforce that do not live here. What are their needs over time? I've talked about housing categories A, B, C, and D. A, housing affordability from 175 to 500,000. B, market rate from 500 to 1.4 million. C, condos and townhomes over 1.5, and D, single family housing over 1.5. The numbers that I've been suggesting are real and supported. The 5,000 B and C I'm suggesting added doesn't even meet the lowest threshold of a 10 to 25,000 housing need. And we really can add quite a bit of housing to our town center based on the FEIS as it's written. What is the effect of meeting 7.1K housing units A and the proposed B and C over the 20-year planning period? Well, from a single family equivalent perspective, from a standpoint of traffic, those units would equate to about 1,700 single family equivalents, which is less than a third of what our city built from 1999 through now. Why do it? For the joy of people that are here now in those two engines that want to stay over life. Holistic enrichments across most of the elements, if not all, that make up Sammamish and a much richer social fabric. What our comp plan has is a number of 2,100 that King County overlaid affordable housing on. What we don't have is quantified factors and legislatively set targets for A, B, or C housing. Not the same thing. This comp plan process and the major steps that led to it didn't include quantified factors and setting internal targets to meet the needs of those 23,000 houses over cycle of life and for future generations and workforce. Shoot, I only got through half my factors. I'll have to come back. Appreciate the chat.
Thanks, Paul. Lena, anybody on the line?
Yes, we have Mary Victor waiting online. Mary, I am promoting you now.
Good evening, Planning Commission. This is Mary Victor. Been in Sammamish for 24, almost 25 years now. I had sent in something middle of March because the city council was passing the 6% tax, which even with that on all the utilities of $11 million isn't fixing the financial imbalance that we have. So our city is not financially sustainable with so many single-family houses and just continuing to grow that way, with 85% of the dwellings in our city being single-family homes, and most of them very large. I also sent you a link to a 10-minute video that is worth watching at least once, if not twice. And if you saw it a month ago, you should try to watch it again. It has what does a financially solvent city look like in 3D. They're 3D real graphs for real cities across the nation, and even in Canada and in Australia, I think. And it shows how the denser areas and the multi-mixed areas, they really do provide net revenue to the city. And then the large single-family homes with cul-de-sacs, which are really private driveways that are publicly paid for, it doesn't work. So we're kind of stuck in that. And the last thing we want to do is make our town center have more single-family housing and not put the density that it can be there. So I liked what Paul Stickney had said in his comment, and then I'm going to switch to tonight since we have non-agenda, agenda, and nothing at the end. So for agenda tonight on permitting, I have done some permits through the city, and the questions and concerns that I have are, when you first don't know what to do, there's a project guidance, and I think you have to type 30 words as a minimum, and it's just, you can put in whatever you want, and then the city gives you back kind of a rough summary or pages from their code and how you navigate that. And then that comes as a project feasibility, and I think they finally updated that because project guidance made a feasibility, which was never numbered. But if people ask things like, can I put a shed on my property, there used to be a really nice video that was produced by, I believe, Avril Beatty and her team that said, hey, even if you want a shed or a gazebo, or even just some sort of wood structure, you do need to have a permit, and you can't just buy a shed from Costco and put it on your property. But then there's some sort of rule that if you're under 198 square feet or something, you can put a shed. Well, that's not true if you're in a critical drainage area, particularly a landslide hazard one. You get 0 square feet of impervious surface to add. Also, things like ditches, stormwater ditches, those don't seem to get caught in the permits that I've seen in our area, and it does cause problems. So somehow that needs to get tied in, whether or not the people have a drainage review, because they can't affect the fullness and the actual function of that ditch. And then the last thing is with steep slopes and some of the other things, when people are building there, they just need to do things differently. And if they aren't, it causes problems. So I don't know what the presentation is tonight, but I won't get the chance to comment on it. So I hope you use what I said already. Thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Anybody else? All right. Thanks to both Paul and Mary. Let's move on to our new business topic for this evening, which is presentation on the city's permitting process. I'm guessing since you're here, David, it's you.
Yes. Good evening, David Pyle, Department of Community Development. This evening we have for your viewing pleasure a presentation on the city's permit process. Since you all are engaged in policy direction and code writing direction, we wanted to make sure that we took the opportunity to go over sort of how the permitting process works and some of the challenges that we face in permitting. Just before we begin, I want to say that permitting is a imperfect process. There are so many different variations of things people are trying to do, and really we're after trying to get the right outcome, the outcome that the city's comp plan envisions and that the regulations envision, and that ultimately would be acceptable to the community. Oftentimes permitting and construction or development of property and brings about a change, and usually people emotionally react to change. So we do often see, as a result of permitting and construction, bringing out the I want to say maybe the not so nice side of communities and the neighbors maybe not getting along and things like that. And we really try to present information and make it available for everyone so they know what's going on. And we're always open to feedback on how to improve that. So with that, I'll jump into the presentation. Let me just make sure I got this. There we go. Really, as I said before, we want to highlight the tie between policy and planning work. We think it's important for you all to understand ultimately what happens once you're done giving recommendation to the council, and then once ordinances are passed and regulations are set. Why do permitting? The obvious answer, it's required by law. We are required to have a permit function. And again, as I stated before, really we're after trying to get outcomes that are acceptable to the community. We also use regulations as, I hate these terms, but both a stick and a carrot, in order to try to get people to build things that will help promote the goals of the community. Affordable housing, for example, is one that's very challenging in trying to get builders to build smaller homes and more diverse housing types. We need to try to find different ways to do that. Yet the market seems to keep wanting to build really large homes. So we're going to continue to work on that. Generally speaking, we have 4 primary categories. The first is the one that we see the highest volume in, and those are ministerial permits. They have minimal process steps. They're really, I call them binary. You either meet the standard or you don't. And if you meet the standard, we grant the permit. These are things like tree permits or clearing and grading permits, or a basic re-roof permit for your home, those kind of things. Administrative are based on objective requirements, and this requires specialized staff review and decision. These are the ones where we start to incur a cost as a city because we now have to have people that are specially trained to review these. Administrative that are based on criteria. These are discretionary decisions that are issued by the director or designee. When we say director, we typically mean whoever the appointed staff person is to review those and approve those permits. Quasi-judicial, those are based on a record. Those are hearing examiner decisions. And we'll get into the exact permit types a little bit below, but I wanted to sort of highlight the differences here. And these also flow from the highest volume to the lowest volume. We get just a few quasi-judicial permits a year. We receive hundreds and hundreds of ministerial permits a year. The real high-level process overview, and we put a lot of work into this. When I first came to the city in 2015, we had people coming into the front counter and talking to planners, which is great, and they would walk away thinking one thing, and the planning staff would leave the front desk thinking something else. We got into a lot of confrontation with people later when they went and invested money into plans or making changes to their property, and they found the plan was not viable or code compliance was called to their property because they thought they could do something that they couldn't. So we took the step of creating project guidance, which is basically where you now are required, anytime you want to engage the city on permit-related topics, to fill out a jot form online. It creates a file, it creates some information about what you're proposing, and it has completely cleaned up all of the misinformation. I won't say 100%, but we no longer have the situations where someone says, but you told me I could do that. We say, okay, well, what was the address and what was the date? And we can go in and search the project guidance and see exactly what they told us they were proposing to do and exactly what we said back in writing to them. So once you get through that process, then usually we outline what the permit requirements are, what the process requirements are, and you would go through the application submittal. The application would be submitted through the My Building Permit portal. It's an online portal. It can be done from your home. You can be done from Arizona if you were in Arizona, and that has really simplified things for people who are busy. We then go through an application screening process where we determine whether or not you have submitted all of the required materials. Depending on the application type, the list of materials can be quite lengthy. That is not where we are completing a full review of the application materials. We're looking to see, does it look like what it's supposed to be? It's not an accuracy review. You then go through the payment and plan review process, where we take in the application review fee and we begin the plan review process. It's assigned to staff, it's routed, there are review deadlines set, And it is then reviewed for compliance with various codes and standards. It includes typically the building review group, the public works review group, and the current planning review group. And there's a permit tech assigned sort of as the project manager to shepherd it through the system. Typically, we don't always see first review decisions. Our goal is to get applications in the door that are complete and are accurate, and we could approve upon receipt. However, almost always there is at least one round of review and correction that is required in order to bring the plan into compliance with city standards. For more complicated projects, we typically see 2 or 3 rounds of review. If it gets to 3 rounds of review, then there is something seriously wrong with the project or seriously wrong with our code standards and process. So we really pay attention to those that are now going beyond 3 rounds of review and why. Usually there's an anomaly. Usually there's extraneous factors, they're anomalies, but nonetheless, they're important to note, and we bring those forward with future code amendments to try and address those issues. Then once the permit is, the plan is approved, then you would pay your permit issuance fee, which generally is the equivalent of the cost recovery for inspections. And you would go about receiving your permit and commencing with your work. We have put a lot of work into our permit center website, our community development page, and there's substantially more information there than there was 10 years ago. Again, project guidance, this is an example of the JOT form that you would fill out. And we've really tried to streamline this, and we have a character limit in a minimum number of characters. And typically people like to attach things, which is normally where we get most of the information. The pre-application conference step, and as I said, there are the 4 different categories, right? There was the ministerial, there was the administrative, which is criteria-based, and there was the administrative, which is discretionary, and then there was finally the quasi-judicial hearing examiner. Pre-application conferences are typically required for the administrative discretionary and the hearing examiner quasi-judicial process. Pre-application conferences typically come along with applications that are more complicated. We also require them when there are critical areas on site. We want to make sure that we have an opportunity to talk about how all of the different regulations work and are at play with each other, and give the applicant an opportunity to present us with a preliminary plan that we can do a preliminary review on and provide feedback on. This is a really helpful step in the process, especially for those more complicated projects. I will note that in order for you to be eligible to apply for a concurrency certificate, so to go to the Public Works Department Transportation Division and submit application for transportation concurrency for those types of projects, you do have to first complete a pre-application conference. So that is one of the entry gates, so to speak, for you to become eligible to apply for a traffic concurrency certificate. We, again, have put a lot of work into creating checklists and submittal forms. This has really helped us clean up the application materials that we're getting. If the applicant takes the time to read through the submittal charts and checklists that we have and prepares information that follows along with the guidance that's given from those forms, usually that applicant will achieve a complete application. We do have applicants that do not want to follow the forms and do not want to submit all the materials, and we reject those applications as incomplete and send them back. So we try to be very helpful. We try to help people understand what is the minimum necessary information we need, what is the optimal that we need. Things are getting more complicated, and we want to make sure that applicants are aware in advance before they make the investment in designing something, what is actually required to get a permit. Going back to application screening, that step in the process, this is something that staff takes seriously, but also at the same time, this is not a step in the process that is cost recovered. So one of our goals is to make sure that we, as a department, are primarily cost recovered, that development pays for development, and that we are constantly monitoring the amount of time that we're spending on these different steps in the process. This is one step that we take before we receive payment that we are not able to recover. So we are trying to be as efficient as we can. And once again, we are not reviewing the materials for their actual accuracy. However, we are reviewing them to try and get a head start on the application, and we do reach out to applicants if we see something that stands out in our screening. We do have an adopted fee schedule. There are pages and pages to it. We went through a major overhaul of this fee schedule about 2 years ago. And we are, again, in the process of looking at each of the cost centers and how our fees stack up against our expenses with regard to time spent on different permit application types. The city used to have more of a flat rate that applied more generically. However, we have really parsed it down to different application types, and we feel that we are much more realistic and close to what we actually will spend. If there is unspent monies, an applicant can ask at the end for those to be refunded. They're not automatically refunded. I don't know why, but that is something that an applicant has the option to do, and we do hear regularly from applicants if they ask if there was any balance left and if that could be refunded. Plan review, we have really tried to create checklists and SOPs for our planning staff so that we are consistent in review of applications. In the older days, in my time in this career path, it was really dependent on whether the planner would remember to review something or to check for something. And as things have become more layered and more complex, we have created these checklists for our applicants, kind of like an airplane pilot taking off and following a pre-flight checklist. We want to make sure that we have helped our staff be successful and that they've reviewed everything that they're supposed to review for that application type. Plan review completion, again, we hope that it would be approved. However, we do often require corrections. Some of them are big, some of them are small. And there are times when we are able to redline a plan or condition a plan in order to avoid a costly correction round. I think applicants appreciate that. If it's something that really is not that big a deal, why are we sending them a letter asking them to resubmit a change if we can just condition the permit or redline the plan? Again, you go back through the same process again where you resubmit your plans back into My Building Permit, and we screen it to make sure everything that was asked for is submitted. We have had a challenge in the past with applicants that would give us some of the things we asked for, but not all of them, and then want us to count that as a review cycle. We have become fairly rigid on that, and we will not take application materials back in if they do not include a memo outlining how all of the corrections have been addressed. Again, payment at permit issuance is done through the My Building Permit portal. It includes any balance of plan review fees, inspection fees, impact fees, if appropriate or applicable, a Washington Code Council surcharge, and surface water development charge, which is part of the Independent Surface Water Fund. Then again, the permit is issued through My Building Permit, and someone can go about completing the work they want to complete. Getting into a little more detail about the what I called ministerial permit, the type 1 decision, that is something that is made by the director, but I say this is made by the line staff. I'm usually not involved. I think I'm very seldomly involved in making type 1 decisions. Usually that is delegated down to the person who is actually in review. It's the most efficient way to do things. And these types of permits are really pretty straightforward. Tree permits, I will say, are never really straightforward, but really try our best to be very, put things into different categories and try and simplify that process. Ministerial permits or type 1 permits are appealable to through to Superior Court as a LUPA appeal. So either the applicant disagrees with the city's conditions or with the permit in general, they could appeal it. Or if a neighbor was unhappy with the outcome of permit review, a neighbor could appeal it to Washington State Superior Court. We do see those types of appeals. Usually those are settled before it gets to court. Usually an applicant is willing to work with an appellant because they see that it will be faster for them to just make the basic change to the plan that might satisfy the issue instead of going through the very lengthy process of taking something to Superior Court. Type 2 decisions, again, these are the discretionary decisions, and these are permits where we issue a staff report, a decision is issued, and it's appealable to the city's hearing examiner. So if a neighbor was unhappy with the outcome, or if there was something that the city missed, that there was a problem with the permit, which has happened, and it was taken to the hearing examiner, then the hearing examiner would have the option of either dismissing the appeal, remanding it back to staff, or depending on what it is, overturning the decision. And we have had the examiner move to, when we've denied permits, move to issue the permit because the examiner found that with the additional information provided by the applicant, it was appropriate to approve it. Moving on to the next category, type 3 decision and type 4 decision. These are quasi-judicial decisions. The type 3 is not appealable locally. It's appealable to Superior Court because it is a decision that's made by the hearing examiner. The type 4 decision is appealable to the State Shorelines Hearings Board. Those are for shoreline permits. That might be a shoreline substantial development permit or a shoreline variance or a shoreline conditional use permit. Most of our shoreline is built out, so we have very few of those. Typically, we see those in the form of a new dock. The type 3 decision is a long subdivision or a zone reclassification. That might be, for example, a larger subdivision project where the staff have issued a recommendation to the hearing examiner. The hearing examiner holds a hearing, and there might be somebody who's not satisfied with the hearing examiner's decision on it, and then they would file an appeal to Superior Court on that. We don't usually see those. Those come probably once every 5 years, not very common. Shoreline permits, these are permits that are specific to the city's shoreline overlay district. So this would include Lake Washington, Lake Sammamish, Pine Lake, and Beaver Lake. And it includes the lake itself and all lands 200 feet landward of the ordinary high water mark. Typically within that overlay, there is a different set of standards that apply, although not entirely. There are unique things that are called out in the Shoreline Master Program that are specific to the shorelines. So the city's zoning controls apply except for those that are called out specifically and modified by the Shoreline Master Program. For example, we measure height differently in the shoreline. We have a different tree retention standard. We have different setbacks. And there is a different method of treating you call it the backyard or front yard. It depends. Some people call it their front yard, but the shoreline edge, there is a different layer of restriction on how you can use that area. There's a 50-foot shoreline buffer. Typically, it's 45 feet on Pine Lake and Beaver Lake, but on Lake Sammamish, it's 50 feet. And within that zone, there are significant limitations on what you can do with your property. Really, it's about it's no net loss of ecological function, so they're trying to promote retention of significant vegetation, tree retention, those types of things that might go hand in hand with the ecology of the lake. One important piece about shorelines is that the city has a shoreline master program, although the city does not own its shoreline master program. Under the Shoreline Management Act of the State Department of Ecology is required to generate standards by which a city is obligated to develop a shoreline master program and implement its program. A city goes through the process of developing a locally tailored shoreline master program, and then has to seek approval from the State Department of Ecology for that program. A program is not deemed to be in effect until the State Department of Ecology approves it. And the State Department of Ecology ultimately owns the master copy of your shoreline master program. A city may not, on its own accord, change the shoreline master program without the State Department of Ecology's approval. It does add some challenging layers when we're trying to change zoning standards and other factors like integrating our critical areas rules into the shoreline master program, because there are things that the State Department of Ecology may not like about our critical areas rules, such as reasonable use exceptions. And they want us to exclude those from our shoreline master program. We're going through that process right now as a follow-up to our critical areas update. Town center permits. This is another area that is different from the typical zoning in the city. We have a different administrative permit process. We have what's called the Unified Zone Development Permit or Plan process. And we have what I call stacked administrative permits. So typically to do outside of the town center, if you were pursuing a subdivision or a short subdivision or a development of a mixed use building in one of the centers, you would be required to go through one layer of administrative permit. That might be a short subdivision approval, a long subdivision approval, a commercial site development permit in order to achieve the planning level permit, if you will. In the town center, we in the TCA have, TCA zone, have what I call a stacked process, where you're required to go through 2 administrative steps before getting to the actual building permit process. You have to go through a unified zone development permit process, and then you have to go through a commercial site development permit process or a subdivision process. So I think the town center southwest quadrant UZDP phase 1 that was recently processed, the one that the city first denied, that was taken to the hearing examiner and was remanded back to us, and that we ultimately approved last year. That following on that, they have broken that into 2 projects. One that now has to go through the subdivision process. That's the Brownstones East. That's been approved. The hearing examiner approved it, and it's now moving to construction. And then on the other side of the project, where the mixed use component is, it has to go through a commercial site development permit process, which is a type 2 administrative permit appealable to the hearing examiner. So it's a bit cumbersome and a bit odd. It's not something that we see in most jurisdictions. And when we come back to you with the town center work, we're going to be talking about some of the permit process changes that the staff will recommend. So that's why I wanted to highlight that one for you. It is seen as a barrier to development in the town center because it results in 2 potential appeal opportunities. It results in a delay. If you're a developer, you're thinking about risk. It's kind of risky. So wanted to highlight that one. Variances. So we're going to get into some of the more standardized processes that we have. There's a real reason for a variance, and it seldom is the case that someone really has a demonstrated need for a variance. It's criteria based, and I think that it must demonstrate a hardship is the real big one. It's that you're being deprived of comparable rights. So if there was an odd intersection configuration, or if there was something about your property and how it interfaced with the community around you, there might be a reason to get a reduction in setback. We have seen those that really are, one when you see one. We had one just recently where it was a property, not a very big property. I think it was like about 7,000 square feet. And they had a giant tree right in the middle of the property, which was really the only place where you could put a house. But our tree rules require that you retain a certain percentage of trees, and there's really no out on that. So that one was a good example of a variance, because we can't tell them to basically create a donut house around the tree. It's challenging. So that's a good example. And they have to go through a bit of a process to demonstrate these things and show us, providing reports that these criteria are being met. Conditional use permit. This one is a really important tool because we have these zoning land use charts in our code that outline all the different use categories, single family residential, park, theater, you name it. There's all the different categories and the different uses, but they're not comprehensive. And there are things that pop up that we can't classify. We don't know what chart to put it in. So what we end up doing is processing it as a conditional use permit. And the idea there is that it requires a notice of application, a sign goes up, a mailing goes out, there's a comment period, we do some research on it, we identify what types of constraints or limits might be needed on that, and we condition it. It's a conditional use permit that ends up running with the project. If the project it becomes abandoned or lapses, or it's not occupied and goes away after 12 months, then the conditional use permit goes away with it. This one also applies to uses that are seen as potentially, if not implemented properly. So it might be an allowed use in the use chart, but it is something that could be detrimental to the community. So what ends up happening is it requires a conditional use permit. I think a kennel is a good example. That we've had kennels that have come in where there's a potential, if it's not designed right, to have a lot of noise in the evenings and weekends, and so usually we check to see how they're building out the kennel facility. There was one just in town center over here that recently vacated, the Petco, I think, right down below Sky Apartments, and they had a kennel as part of that, and that was done through a conditional use permit, for example. Reasonable use exceptions. These are a bit challenging, and I feel like aren't always what we want to see happen, but at the end of the day, Washington State is a property rights state in its constitution, and we can't avoid this. We have to grant someone reasonable use of private property. We can constrain it, and we have worked really hard to narrow these down. We have many development sites in the city, or I guess properties in the city that are undeveloped, that are a bit constrained, very constrained, wetlands, streams, slopes that shouldn't be built on from my perspective, but that we have to allow it if they go through this process and they can demonstrate that they're minimizing, avoiding, and mitigating, then we have to allow that permit activity to happen. There's a lot of confusion about this in the community. Oftentimes people don't understand why we're allowing it, and people get kind of upset about it, but we work really hard to try and help them understand that there are property rights at play, and that at the end of the day, we can't take someone's property. So, but at the same time, we need to work with property owners to make sure that they lower their expectations. You can't put a 5,000 square foot house on a lot that just won't carry it. And that is also a conversation that we regularly have. Temporary use permits. A good example of this recently was the WPGA tournament that came through Sahalee. That was processed through a temporary use permit. These are things that we work really closely with the proponents of the temporary use to make sure that things like parking and access are addressed, and other impacts and no amplified sound, temporary structures. There's a whole host of things that come with temporary uses. Another good example of that is temporary homeless encampments. We've had several of those just right around the corner here at the Mary Queen of Peace Church, and those have been successful largely because we've worked really closely with the group to make sure that some of the concerns of the community and the items in the code that are required to be addressed have been addressed. Right-of-way permits. This applies, I think one of the most often surprises that we get from community members is that they don't necessarily own the land in front of their home that they've been maintaining. Most of our rights-of-way range from 50 to 60 feet in width is a typical section, even in some of the side streets. And that typically extends back into somebody's property anywhere from 5 to 15 feet. So we have had some challenges around people making improvements in the right-of-way. We're working on an education campaign and sort of rebooting the right-of-way code. We've had some challenges with recent fiber laying in the right-of-way as well, where things like side sewers and trees and sidewalks and driveways were really hard to navigate around. It's hard to put conduit in if you're moving through a built-out community. So there are 3 types of right-of-way permits. There are, I think, did I have that below? No. There is a right-of-way use permit. There is a right-of-way construction in the right-of-way, and then there is a right-of-way lease permit. A right-of-way lease permit, a good example is a cell tower. And that's where somebody is actually leasing public property for private use. You might have the equipment cabinet in the tower, for example. The others might be, the others are primarily related to, for the use, it's traffic management. Usually those types of permits are related to somebody who's going to be unloading a big load of lumber in the street, and they're going to need to shut down a few lanes for a period of time. And they need to have traffic control in place and signage and early warning. And then the other is related to construction in the right-of-way, and that is where somebody's actually making improvements, and that we want to make sure that the improvements being made are brought up to public works standards and are inspected to standards, so that our right-of-way is consistently built and it reduces the amount of risk and other potential liability. Inspections. This is a really important part of the whole process. When you receive your permit, the first thing you are required to do is to hold a pre-construction inspection. Not all pre-construction inspections are executed the same way. It really depends on the scale and scope of the project. This is the opportunity for the builder and the construction team to meet with the inspection team. We also at times like to include public works engineers or city planning staff to make sure that there is a handoff from the office team, so to speak, to the field team. This is a process that we need to continuously revisit to make sure that's happening smoothly. The office team typically that does permit review works really well together, and the inspection team works really well together. But sometimes there are things that are lost in translation when you're transitioning from the permit review process to the actual construction inspection process. Generally speaking, you progress through, inspections are loaded depending on the permit type. They're not always all required. However, they are generally logical and progress in a manner that follows the type of project you're doing. New single family home, for example, you're starting down in the foundation phase and you're moving up into framing and up into rough-in and ultimately into finishing. And the inspection process does follow that. We do have the opportunity for an applicant who does not pass inspection to request an additional inspection. However, there is a re-inspect fee that goes along with that. This does require a lot of continuing education on the part of our inspectors. Construction trends are constantly changing. There's new technology, there are new energy codes, there are new things that are being done in the field. Another challenge is trying to navigate field changes. There are generally 2 levels of field change: the type of field change that an inspector can approve in the field, that they write some notes in the permit system and they will outline what they accepted, take some pictures. There are other field changes that require the applicant to submit a plan to document it. And then finally, there is a field change that stops the project. The applicant has to submit a revision to the plan and then has to have that plan approved and reissued before they can commence with it. It really depends on the scale of the change. Let's see. Project closeout. This is a really important part of the process that sometimes is overlooked on the part of staff. We try really hard to focus on these. However, when you're constantly triaging things that are right in front of you, this is a lesser priority. This includes things like final inspections and making sure to log what happened on final inspection and cleaning up the entire file, both in the records and in terms of the data entries and notes entries. It's the release of performance agreements and financial guarantees. I think I'll note we do utilize performance agreements and financial guarantees in situations where we think there is risk that the applicant will not be successful. And we want to emphasize that this is a very important component of the project. More recently, we have been using these in tree retention because we have been finding that when we are not on site and not present, that sometimes builders tend to move tree protection fences and place equipment and materials in those locations or trench through those areas. So we have been finding that it is more and more important for us to require performance agreements and financial guarantees for successful tree retention. It kind of gets their attention when you make them, when you require that they submit a bond in the amount of $1,500 a diameter inch for the tree, each tree that is, you can see pretty quickly that that amount of bond goes up a lot. So it is a tool that we're using more and more frequently. Recording of documents is another really important part of the process. Sometimes there are easements that are required. Sometimes there is a final plat. There's a whole host of things that can be recorded at the tail end of a project when it's complete. And then finally, the last one, which is easier for us now than it used to be because we do everything electronically, is archiving. Back in the days of paper, we used to have to go through the file and figure out what to keep and what to throw away. Now everything is just simply retained electronically. Although I think we're going to get to a point at some point where we're going to rethink that because the amount of data that we're storing is ever increasing. Public process. I think this is really an important part. It's one that we're always trying to improve. I think right away that anyone out there listening has access to look at permits that are available for any property in the city through the mybuildingpermit.com portal. You can punch in a parcel, you can punch in an address. You could even search by permit types for recently submitted permits or recently issued permits. There are quite a few search tools available there. The next is the public records request portal. This could be for an address or for a certain type of permit that might have been submitted during a certain time frame. We always strongly suggest that interested parties go through the My Building Permit portal and try and find things that they might be interested in and then submit a very specific request through the PRR process. We have lots of PRRs that are very vague and they're quite hard and challenging to process. So the more help we can get with those, the better. Public noticing and information. We have, and I meant to add a sample notice. Actually, I think, yeah, there we go. Here is a notice of application. I apologize for that note. It was there for me to add it, and I did. So notice of application, this is a good example. This is a basic 4-lot short plat, and you can see the type of information that's included in it. It's not very attractive, I'll say that. But what we're trying to do is include a lot of information in a very small space. There are things that are required to include there, and there are things that we feel are beneficial to include. So you can see here, for example, when the application was submitted, when it was determined complete, what the date of this notice is. There's a brief description. We include, as a matter of open record, all of the application documents received. We put those on an FTP. I think that is something the community is not aware of, but every time there is an application that comes through that requires public notice, all of the application materials are posted with the notice through an FTP link. And anybody can look at any of the files and they do not have to actually file a public records request. The intent there is that is helping facilitate someone's understanding of the project so that they can then provide informed comment during the public comment period, which is shown there. If I was to retool this one, I'd probably make the public comment period font bigger so someone could see that. Then it identifies who the contact is. And then there are just some fine print at the bottom that we're required to include. So this type of notice goes out with a type 2, type 3, or type 4 application. It does not go out with a ministerial permit type because those do not have a comment period and they are not locally appealable. That's it for my presentation. That is really a high-level review. There is quite a bit more going on with permitting behind the scenes that I'd be happy to answer any questions on. And if you have a follow-up question that you come across in the weeks that follow this presentation, feel free to reach out to me. I'd be happy to go get coffee and talk about permitting. I started my career as a permit technician, and I've worked my way up through every step, every level in the community development department. So I've seen a lot of permitting over the years.
All right, who has questions about the exciting topic of permits? Ajay, go ahead.
Thank you so much. This was wonderful. So I have just a couple of questions on this thing. The first question that I have is that what happens when you get something that is, everybody is trying to do something modern with their dwelling, if we'll call that. What happens if it's a little unconventional? I don't know, they're trying to do something rainwater harvesting or something like that. Do you then get consultants, and does that fee get transferred to the applicant, or is this something that gets taken in by the city?
So for things that there are, let me start with a couple examples. When somebody is pushing the limits with their tree retention and they're doing things that are probably a bit unconventional, they want to use air spades through the root zones. They don't want to follow the traditional root zone and they want to bore through it or use an air spade to find their way through it. We would utilize a third-party consultant, and that cost would be passed back to the applicant.
Got it.
That is a downside to the third-party process.
Got it.
For things like rain harvesting, that would be done. It is probable that our public works stormwater staff have seen that. We have seen it with plumbing, right? So when somebody is using a secondary plumbing system in their home, we have some of those in the city. We have that at Sky Apartments. They collect rainwater and they've used that to plumb a secondary line for toilets and some other uses. So there are instances when we do require a consultant be brought on, and that cost is passed back to the applicant. However, in most cases, it's translated to staff hours, and it's a comparable cost to what would be otherwise billed if the staff were reviewing it.
Got it.
If that makes sense.
Yes, it does, because I was going to ask that as a bonus question, but you answered that question before I asked that. The second question I had was that on the Permit Center Services Quick Guide that I was going through it, I saw that you have an online, in-person, and virtual session for general questions about the permitting process. And I was like, is that common? People come in person to ask questions about the permitting process?
Absolutely. And in fact, let me share this. We've recently tailored our system so that we now have, there are multiple ways that you can get a hold of us. There is, and Lena here happens to field a lot of these calls because she's at the front counter and helping out with our customer service end, and she does a great job routing calls to where they should go. Our staff are not, and I don't mean this flippantly, I don't know the right way to say this, so it might come across as harsh, but I'm going to say it the way I know how. Our staff are not just sitting around waiting for phone calls. They are deeply immersed in plan review, and if they were to stop and pick up the phone every time the phone rang, it would take them forever to get through plans, and we would be way behind on our work. So what they tend to do is to collect calls and return those calls at the end of the day or the next day. Some of them are better at it than others. We're constantly working on that. But what we've realized is that people want to be able to meet in person. People want to be able to meet virtually. and they want to be able to set up an appointment. So we've created, we have a bookings app that we use, and you can go in here and you can book an appointment with one of our planners and figure out, so here's, for example, you can choose who you want to meet with, and that can either be virtual or in person. Set up the appointment. Before we allow this to happen, though, we usually require that you have gone through at a minimum the project guidance process, because we do want a starting place where we have the ability to do some research on the property, understand what you're generally proposing. I don't find it productive to have cold call meetings with somebody when I haven't been able to research the property. I don't have an idea what they're proposing, when they just want to come in and basically throw a bunch of questions at me. It's always more informed if we're able to do some background research first before meeting with them.
Got it. Got it. That was what I had. So thank you.
Syed?
David, I have a question about the concurrent review. Do you have that policy that you have a meeting? I used to be involved in a lot of things that you're talking about, that representative of the different department, that they get involved in different steps of the permit process. We usually used to meet once a week to go over, so I can hear the comments from the fire department, from the police department, from the transportation, from the land use and so forth, and communicate and have a basically discussion of that project that helps the staff, basically helping the staff of different departments kind of interact on different aspects of the project. Do you have that concurrent review?
We do use concurrent review. We have deadlines. So the comment letter that's issued is a single comment letter that comes from all of the departments. And the departments have different ways, depending on the permit type, they have different ways in which they engage in review. So, there are permit types where planning and fire and building and public works all get together and look at plans and talk about the different components of it and then generate their comments. There are other permit types where they are working together but independently and putting their plans. They use Bluebeam. It's a software that allows you to put notes in and things, and they're all working at it on the same time, and they call each other, or they go to each other's desks and talk about things they're facing. But really, that is their collaboration space, is Bluebeam, where they're able to see each other's notes. And they've gotten quite good at using it. I'm always impressed with the amount of detail that's in those notes. So there are different methods that are used by staff internally. If an applicant during the process comes across a comment that they have a question about, they can reach out to the relevant staff person, the discipline who provided that comment. But we don't generally review permits with the applicant in the room, so to speak. That's not something we do.
No, I was not talking about applicants. I was talking about among the staff of different departments. Second question, do you treat residential and the commercial development process as far as the permit process, or you just combine it and kind of go through based on the time of application?
So we are managing different timelines for different project types, and every staff person has a variety of permit application types that they're in review of. So they have to be able to manage their time accordingly. We utilize the workspace function of our permit tracking software to help understand what the different project types are, what the priorities and deadlines are, and the staff then basically prioritize their daily work according to that workspace. Now they're also required to return phone calls and provide public information and things. And so what it generally works out to is that a staff person will spend a portion of their day doing some deep dives into things like a subdivision. They'll spend a portion of their day processing tree permits or other basic ministerial permits, and then they'll spend a portion of their day doing things like new single-family homes or other relatively complicated, but not as complicated as like a plat type permit. And every day is different, right? It really depends where they are in that workspace. The workspace presents a deadline for when it's due. However, one of the challenges that I'm always working with them on is I want them to manage to the middle of the deadline, not the end of the deadline, because if you manage to the end of the deadline, then everything is turned in at the deadline. So that's a bit of an internal thing that we're working on constantly.
Have you thought about developing some kind of flow chart graphically to show that the stage that this applicant's project is in the review process?
So we have some really great flowcharts. I think there was one linked in the agenda bill. It's kind of like reminds me of the game Chutes and Ladders, and it's a graphic chart that shows how you get to a permit and has all the steps outlined in it. I'll send it out after the meeting.
Could it be interactive so the applicant can basically see where his or her application is?
I would love to do that. That depends on the amount of money and time we have for investment.
Is there any attempt to expedite the process time-wise and dedicate the amount of time and say, okay, this project, the maximum amount of time for this step of this project would be this much? So the applicant knows that, hey, it's going to be within 10 days or 15 days that project goes through that step of the process.
We have done negotiated timelines with some applicants. Usually when everything's an emergency, then nothing's an emergency. So, we tend to shy away from that because what the predicament that I commonly find us in is when an applicant wants us to hurry up and review their application, yet they haven't given us quality information and help facilitate a fast review of that application.
And how do you communicate those shortcomings or problems with the applicant?
Corrections letter.
Correction letter or email? Or?
Also phone calls. One of the things that I routinely advocate with the staff is that if they come across a question in a plan set, don't just create a revision letter and not continue to review. I want them to comprehensively review the entire plan set, identify all the things that where there might be challenges or design changes needed. And if they come across something that they don't understand, call the applicant. Pick up the phone. That usually will help. There have been numerous occasions when I used to do plan review where I didn't understand something and called them and they explained it to me, and it was on this other sheet over here buried in the plan somewhere, and that explained it, and okay, I get it. So I was able to move on.
And that solved the problem?
It can solve the problem. It doesn't always.
How do you rate the process that you have in here with the other adjacent cities? Are we in the same ballpark as far as the time of review, challenges, difficulties, and all that?
We're right within range of other jurisdictions and what they're providing. I think we all take a position at times. We all receive the label from master builders of being the one that's slow. At a time, we all take a turn. It just depends on workload, on volumes, on staffing. Staffing is a huge part of that. It's really hard to find staff that are skilled at doing plan review.
How about coordination with the other agencies? Is that the applicant's responsibility or the city's responsibility? Let's say the developer has put in the plan but needs a permit from an agency other than the city.
So it depends. In shoreline permitting, that's really common, where you're required to get an Army Corps permit, you're required to get a Fish and Wildlife hydraulic project approval, you're required to, there's a whole host of things that you're required to do with shoreline permitting. That is the applicant's responsibility. However, one of the things that we do try to help out with is helping them understand the sequence, because you can't get a hydraulic project approval unless you have a SEPA threshold determination. So we try to work with them in order to help get them the materials that they need so that they can also continue to advance with those other agency approvals.
Now, you mentioned about town center permit process. Do you think that would require more time for the applicant to go through that process, or there's going to be less time?
The current process, definitely more time. Because it's a stacked process with 2 administrative cycles as opposed to outside of the town center, just 1 administrative cycle.
What is the possibility of combining these 2 different cycles?
That's one of the proposals we'll be bringing back for you.
Okay, thank you.
Hey, Sean.
most of the things I had in mind, you already answered them during the presentation, and Sayed asked for them. Just want to thank you for the presentation and walking us through this. What's the average time frame of reviewing, let's say, an average project, which in Sammamish, I'm assuming it's a house?
So I would say that and I'm not looking at any data. You know, the time frame to get from application to permit might range from 11 to about 18 months. It really depends on the application. Now, that's not all the city and having the city in its possession. If we were to pull the shot clock, you know, I'm going to guess that it's probably about 120 days for the city in its possession. So, you know, there's one of the inefficiencies of permitting, and we've helped this out a bit with electronic permitting, is the application's received, it gets filed, it gets routed, it gets reviewed. We have a 2-month review cycle for the first round, because that's usually where review is a little deeper, more complicated. Our goal is to identify all the corrections in the first round. Then the applicant will resubmit, and we issue a correction letter, and then it'll take them anywhere from, we give them up to 90 days to resubmit, and they usually take 45 to 60 days to resubmit. So we go through another round where we have a 1-month review cycle, and then they come, and usually there's another round of corrections, and then they come back with the final submittal another 60 days later. So you could see how that time can stack up. At times, there are things that require the applicant to engage another consultant, like, for example, a geotechnical engineer or a structural engineer, and those can delay their resubmittal. At times, there are things that they submit that require us to engage a third party, like a civil or, a wetland scientist or something, and those can also cause additional time on our end when we have to get it queued up and do a task order to the consultant and all of those sorts of things. 11 months would be the short end of a new single family home permit, which is quite a bit of time. I could pull the statistics on that actually and send it out tomorrow or early next week to you all, so you could see what those timeframes are. We actually just published a report for the State Department of Commerce, because now that's a new rule under SB 5290 where we worked on the process improvements, and it's posted to our website, but it doesn't include single family homes. So I would want to add that data set for you.
Yep, thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Mike?
I was interested in timeframes as well. And I guess maybe just a little bit of an elaboration since you're on that. What you described, some of the total time is in control totally of Sammamish City. Some of it is absolutely, the applicant is slow to return, or they're getting outside consultant or whatever. For those things that are within control, let's just continue with the single family, about just how much time is taken up, real time, not like individual work time, calendar time, for that particular example that we're on.
So new single family home?
Yeah, because that best case 11 months includes some turnaround from an applicant, right? So
yeah, so it'd be the initial intake. So I'd give that, say that's 3 weeks, just takes 3 weeks. Then we have 2 months, so now you're at 11 weeks. That's the first turnaround. And assuming you get it out within that time frame, which is what we're really trying to do, we have had some staffing challenges, whether it's we all take a turn with it, whether it's Public Works, whether it's fire, with our contract with fire, and they do a good job. I'm not bashing them by any means, just that people leave the organization and we don't have a deep enough staff pool where there is extra capacity where someone can just take more projects. So if you have somebody who leaves the organization, you have to go through the whole HR process of getting that position filled, which can take 6 to 8 months. In the meanwhile, you have a vacancy that you're dealing with. So that's one of the reasons why. And we usually have 1 or 2 vacancies that we're fighting, where we're trying to keep those positions filled. So now we're at 11 weeks. Then you send it back to the applicant. The applicant does their thing with it, however long they take. Then we get it back, and usually I would say it's a couple days in process. So let's say another week, so it's 12 weeks. And then there's we have 2 weeks on that next end. So now you're at about 14 weeks. And then you issue another correction letter. And then that would be however long the applicant takes. And then we have another 2 weeks to review it. So 3 weeks, because there's the process to intake, move it around in the system. Then there's the actual assigned time for the planner. So what are we at now? Is that 18 weeks, 19 weeks? Yeah. And then once the permit's ready to be issued, then it gets routed to the permit center. The permit center has to go through the process of stamping all the plans, making sure all of the conditions are in there, right? All the paperwork is there. They generate fees. They notify the applicant that the fees have been generated. Usually the applicant, no offense to the applicants, usually they want to argue about the fees and whether something applies or not. It takes a couple extra days. Then they'll finally pay the fee, which is a big fee to their credit, and they're trying to figure out and understand what they're paying for. And then the permit gets issued. So all of those points in the process add time. We used to have paper files, and we used to move the paper files around. Things would get lost. Things would get stranded on someone's desk.
I'm glad you don't have to deal with that now.
So now it's all in one place. It's a lot faster. But there are always opportunities to clean this up. I think a lot of it comes back to efficient use of time and staffing.
And you've talked basically about a half year of real time that's sitting in there. First, relatively straightforward permitting process. I will say, from what you're describing, it sounds like you've done a lot to try to mitigate the rework that occurs with checklists up front and those sorts of things, which saves gobs of time. And really, the reason I think we're asking about these things is, if I understand, we're going to be doing some work around the town center and the permitting there, and being able to collapse time is money. So, getting the right things done, but doing them efficiently will be something that I'm sure I'll be looking at, as well as I suspect other commissioners as well.
Absolutely, and making standards more objective, so making them easier to apply where it's clear that it meets it or not.
Yeah.
The more complicated the rules get, the more challenging things are. I'd say the biggest barrier that staff have and applicants have to successful project permit review is the fact that there are so many things competing for space on a site, whether it's tree retention, it's landscaping requirements, it's putting in driveways and walkways, it's impervious surface limits, it's hardscape limits, it's stormwater management, and putting in a vault or this or that, and it's all of these things that are competing for space on a site plan, and making sure that each one of them meets the letter of the law with regard to the regulation that applies to that specific component of the plan or of the project. And oftentimes you also have an architect, an engineer, a homeowner who really wants things a certain way, but has to sometimes deal with the reality that they're not going to get it exactly how they want it. And then also a builder who then has to tell them whether it's buildable or not and what it's going to cost. And I would say that what comes with that is that homeowners usually go to their architect first. And usually they start working out a floor plan with their architect before they even do an inventory of what the sites can carry, before they even do, a talk about tree retention, how they're going to handle stormwater. And they start laying out the floor plan where the closet is and where the kitchen is and how big the dining room's going to be. And it is a very emotional, difficult thing for them to then go through a redesign to move things around when they come to the hard reality of the fact that that house cannot fit on that site.
All right. Sounds like a very challenging process, all in all. And clearly, the way you can list everything, you've got a ton of expertise, and it really shows. So appreciate you working on this.
Sure.
John, go ahead.
Maybe you covered a lot of ground without covering a lot of ground as well. I mean, I thought the balance of your presentation was just about right in terms of detail without us getting into the grassroots. One of the things you came up with a couple questions was staffing, and maybe speak a few sentences on the budgeting process and forecasting for your fee recovery and staffing and the challenges you face there.
Right. So we need to look forward to the number of applications and the type of applications and the complexity that we're going to be receiving. We also need to then look to our fee schedule and assess the amount of revenue that will be generated from those applications. We then have to continuously monitor what's coming in the door. The good news is that the staff that we hire, we work really hard to hire staff that are that can play multiple roles. So when we see a downturn, we're able to redeploy those staff into positions such as supporting policy work. For a period of time, we have a backlog of policy work that we always need to get done. Things like lighting and noise and small animals, the fun stuff. And we continue to work on that. But if we're really, really busy, we also use an elastic system where we have on-call consultant support that we're able to then bring in. When we see staff depart unexpectedly, which happens, we're able to then ramp up the on-call consultant. We're very fortunate to have really good staff right now. I've been through some cycles of staff where we've had ups and downs, and everybody has a winter in life, and people are challenged at times with things. And one of the big challenges we have is that our staff live far away, and our staff cannot afford to live here. They're paid decently, let's be clear, but even when they're paid decently, they cannot afford to live on the east side, especially and raise a family and have those components. So it is we're fortunate to be able to have a hybrid workplace. I don't know the right balance of in-office and remote work. I'm sort of tending more recently towards more in-office, but the staff are still successful at completing their work remotely, and we are able to follow that. So if we were to lose the remote work component, we would have a very hard time recruiting as a city.
Thank you. Also mentioned by some of the others, maybe you could talk a little bit about the cooperation you need in the permitting process with public health, Sam Platt, East Side Fire, and the challenges and successful endeavors there.
Absolutely. So, it all starts at the policy planning level. We pay a close attention to Sam Platt's and the Northeast District's water and sewer comprehensive plans, and we make sure to work closely with them that those are aligned. We understand their service delivery plans, and then that plays out in the water and sewer availability certificate process, where an applicant, when they first start coming in and engage us through our project guidance process, they're also on a parallel path asked to go engage the water and sewer district to make sure they have water and sewer availability. Depending on the project type, some of our projects also require that they engage the school district and make sure that there is school capacity. We have school concurrency requirements in the city. We have a large areas in our city that are not sewered. I think you've heard Mary Wichter talk about that on several occasions, and she continues to talk about it, rightfully so. It is a challenge in the city, and we do work with public health to make sure that septic permits are processed in a timely manner and that applicants know that they're required to get them. It does present I don't know the right word for it. I'll call it the chicken egg syndrome, where you don't really know which one should get out ahead, whether you should get the septic permit first or the building permit first, depending on who you talk to. I think each one thinks that their permit should be the last one to be issued. So it is a challenge. We do work with them closely. There are new septic rules that I think have just been passed. Seattle King County Public Health just updated its public health standards and code, and there are new on-site sanitary sewer system requirements, and we'll be working through those. That's one of the things when we have free staff time that I pull the staff off of plan review and have them work on things like the new King County OSS standards. Like those are some of the kind of things. But we do work closely. We have a close relationship with Eastside Fire. They serve as reviewers, and actually one of the things we've done to pull in Sam Platt and to pull in the Northeast District and to pull in, I have to check with the Northeast District, but I know Sam Platt and Eastside Fire is that they have access to our permit tracking system, and they use that alongside us to make sure that we have concurrent reviews happening and that they're aware of the things that are moving through the system and the status. And they are a reviewer in our system, so we don't inadvertently approve a permit that was not approved by Fire or by Sam Platt, for example.
I'd say, at least in my experience, what you've done with that is kind of unusual to get that level of coordination, cooperation. So
it has to be maintained, and a lot of it is interpersonal relationships we have with their staff. So we do have to, put effort into maintaining relationships as you would with any in life.
Right. So lastly, just personal note, I've gone through extensive permit process with the city in the last several years. I found it consistent, predictable. The inspectors were a great resource. It was a good experience. I'm unusual in the sense that, like Syed, I have a lot of background in development services, so I knew what to expect, but still the materials were good and looks like it's even better now. Oh, and one last question. Do you have any materials out there on the middle housing overlay yet? Have you got any applications?
So we have been working on developing those. We have been focused on providing responses to a wide range of questions about the inclusionary affordability requirements. So that has been our focus because that's where most of the questions have been coming from. We have had quite a bit of interest in middle housing. We've seen so when everybody submits a project guidance, they come through pretty regularly. I get copied on all of them. So I see them pop up. I'm in a meeting and I see a project guidance come in, and I kind of get a flavor for, what the current trend is in the city. And we're seeing a lot of interest about converting garages to ADUs, building ADUs, wanting to build a duplex on somebody's property, smaller projects. We've also had some bigger projects, and we're working through those. Those are more challenging with how the middle housing stuff applies, and we'd love to, I think now that we've been through some project guidance and some pre-apps and have been through, we have another step that I didn't talk about that's called pre-development consultation or pre-development services consultation. And that is a fee-based service where if somebody makes it through project guidance and they make it through a pre-app and they have very specific questions that they want answered, that could take a lot of staff time researching, we charge an hourly fee and we'll provide a written response to those questions so that somebody can get a predictable answer in writing before they submit their application and go through that process. We found that it's pretty helpful, but we have had some applicants take us up on that with middle housing recently. So what we're hopeful to do is to take all of those inquiries and our responses and start to see where we need to provide information and build out some public information handouts or tip sheets or a whole sub page. We now have an affordable housing page on the website. We'd love to create a middle housing page there as well. And we're working on that, trying to get that done. I will say that one of the fascinating things that we're finding is that there's a myriad of controls, and I could stop if you want me to, but I just want to mention this, that there's a myriad of controls that we put in place for middle housing, whether it is an FAR limit, 0.5 for one, 0.65, 0.8, 0.95, you recall how that added up. But there are other controls, like a 3,000 square foot footprint for building, right? So that's another control. The building height, So you can only go 3 stories. That's another control. So now we're talking about envelope, floor to area ratio, footprint, height. Then there's another control that we added, which is turning out to be really helpful, is the 40%, I think it was 40% hardscape, which includes impervious surfaces, patios, pervious pavements, artificial turf, because that's a thing now. And so what's happening, we're finding, is that between all of those controls, we're seeing, if you were to build a 3-pack, that's the sweet spot to be in, and it allows each unit to be, I want to say they come out right around 2,400 square feet in that 3-pack. So if you built a stacked flat or a row house, a townhome, the units, the garages are not inclusive. It'd be about 3,000 square feet per unit, but the garage comes out of that and other things. So it's a bigger townhome, but it's something that provides 3 bedrooms plus a flex space. So it's marketable for the community. We think that's something that we'll start to see built. We're also seeing an increase in interest in detached accessory dwelling units, maybe even stacking 2 of them in the backyard, where you can go to 24 feet with 1,000 square foot building footprint, 2 stories, 2 ADUs, that kind of thing.
A couple questions, David. First, and maybe I misunderstood this, but why are we talking about this? Kind of where are we going with this conversation? What's the long game of this conversation?
Yeah, the long game is to talk a bit about the city's, so the permit process in general is trying to highlight how some of the changes and things we've been talking about are implemented on the ground. It's informational. It gives you opportunity to ask questions and learn about our permit process. Some of you have more knowledge than others on that. And we really wanted to take the time, we're doing this with the council next Tuesday as well, to present to you sort of an overview about how permitting works in the city. And it helps give an understanding that when we're considering things like code changes or town center process changes, or when we went through 5290, sort of how that plays out and where those things fit in. It's part of our interest in making sure that the commission is informed and has opportunity to ask about administrative functions of the city.
Okay. More specific, is there something somewhere? So one of the things I was thinking about is you have small projects and medium projects and large projects, and a lot of the small ones are, in my mind, a shed, a deck, something like that. Is there somewhere that somebody could go and it would be like, the closest thing I could compare it to is a FAQ, but that's not quite what it is. It's like, here are the 10 things that most commonly come up when you want to build a shed in your backyard. This isn't the whole list, but make sure if you want to build a shed, before you submit anything, look at these 10 things. Here's the 15 things that we always seem to talk about when you want to build a deck. So, something like that to just get people who are frequently, because somebody's building a house, they probably got an architect. The architect probably knows a lot of that kind of stuff, right?
Right.
But somebody who just wants to build a shed in their backyard, and they think, well, I could just build a shed in my backyard, I'll just go get a permit. But they are starting from a knowledge base that's sometimes very limited. And so giving them hey, so you want to build a shed, make sure you look out for these things, and here's how you start. To try to, a lot of what you're doing, it feels like, is trying to ease the process a bit so that you don't have to do all of that to begin with. And like I say, if you have professionals involved who do it all the time, that's kind of their job. But if you have a homeowner who just wants to build a deck on the back of their house, they don't know any of that. So do you have some way to get them started? Which also would ease, I would think, the burden on staff time too.
So some number of years ago, when we first started the project guidance process, where you had to submit the project guidance, we went through and we queried the data from that and identified the top 10 things people were submitting for, right? Deck, fence, shed, and we created tip sheets. So we have tip sheets on the webpage. The hard part is making sure that you find the tab that gets you to the tip sheets.
Yeah, I looked for it a little bit. I didn't run across it, but I didn't spend a lot of time.
And I, even I sometimes things get moved around, things get added, and I sometimes have a hard time finding it. So it's a good reminder for me to ask Avril, our permit center, current planning and permit center manager, to try and float it to the top again. But yes, we do have those tip sheets. We are due to revisit the project guidance applications again and to sort out the highest frequency things and make sure that we're considering trends and responding and creating new tip sheets and also updating the tip sheets because codes do change and things change.
Yeah, it's kind of an 80-20 thing. If you can help people to recognize the majority of things ahead of time, then they're not surprised.
Yes.
Maybe that eases it. Okay. Another question about, with that whole process, when does somebody get assigned a person? So if you're, I don't know, if you're a homeowner and you had hired an architect and you're going to build a house, you're going to do, your preliminary stuff and have the all the pre stuff. But at some point, do you get a project manager who's kind of your single point of contact that you can call and they can either answer your question or say, no, you need to contact this person? When is that in the process?
So we try to parse out the project guidance application or project guidance submittals to the right staff who might carry it through the whole process. So if it's a single family home, well, then those staff that typically process single families, we want to assign it to one of them. But you don't actually receive that project manager, so to speak, until the actual application is really submitted. We try to achieve continuity. I would prefer that the same staff person that replies to the project guidance is the same person that is receiving the new single family home permit and reviewing it to completion. Generally speaking, the people that are always available as the project manager or guide is the permit techs. And they are extremely knowledgeable about how to find things and help guide people through or get in touch with the planner if the planner is buried in plans. Permit techs are very, very responsive and usually are the ones that are the easiest point of access into the system. But yes, and it really depends because each project type, as you ratchet up in complexity, has a different type of system where we have, for example, for a plat or a short plat type 2 or type 3 action or type 4 action even, the planner is the project manager. But for a type 1 action, the permit tech is actually the project manager because it doesn't have the same process that goes with it. There's no public notice, there's no appeal, there's all the things that go along with that. So it really just depends on the project type as to who the project manager is. So the permit tech for simple projects and then the planner for the more complex projects.
Yeah, I just was imagining that it's better for anybody who's applying for a permit if at some point they get one person they can call or email and get what's going on, or do I need to do something? Right, just the basic, which direction is north?
Absolutely.
And then another question I thought about is, it seems I worry that this only goes one direction and that's more complicated. And I think that's unfortunate because if we continue that way in another 10 years, it's going to become, needs more staff. It only contributes to the process being more expensive on both sides and taking longer. And I think that's really unfortunate. It's too bad we can't find a way to. But sometimes we don't have a control over that. I understand that, but it just it seems like it's getting more complicated. And one of the things I wondered about is, at what point does an applicant understand when they need consultants? So, for example, if you have drainage issues on the property you want to build on, you're probably going to need some kind of whether that's a civil engineer or a water, somebody who does design for their septic system or whatever. And I can sense that there's probably lots of disappointment in the process when somebody realizes they thought they were going to spend this much and now they need to go hire 3 different other consultants. And some of that is related to the complexity of the process now. Is that a thing that gets identified for them, or do they only find out when the plan review comes back and you say, you need this, this, and this, and somebody tells them, oh, to do those things, we need to go hire these 5 people?
So some of the codes are really clear that it has to be prepared by a, qualified professional, wetland scientist, civil engineer, geotechnical engineer, a structural engineer. Some of those codes are very clear, but a typical homeowner, layperson might not know where to find what it says when it says that. That would be a good addition, and I'll talk to the team about that in the project guidance notes early in the process, identify maybe down at the bottom, there's a section about other professional support or, expertise needed. We suggest you consider the following for the following reasons, and maybe there's a way to identify, there's a couple spaces where you could fill in, you need wetland scientists to prepare critical areas report or, right? So that then they're at least notified that, hey, that's a possibility that you're going to require that. And they could ask us for follow-up. They could have set up a meeting with the planner and ask, what exactly do you mean by this?
Yeah, well, just based on our very early review, you might need some of the following to get through the permit process, rather than finding out later after they've done all the stuff you described and fixed what their budget target might be, and now they realize they need to spend another $40,000 on consultants.
Yes, and I do hear what you're saying about things getting more complicated. Some of them out of our control. Some of them we as a city choose to do. And a lot of times it has to do with things that the community is concerned about. I will say that tree retention is a really big one, and it causes development review to be really complicated. But we as a community here hold our tree canopy very dear, and we want to make sure we're successful. So we put in place kind of a complicated process to ensure that we're successful, because if left to their own devices, I think it'd be a 50-50 chance that the trees would be retained. Some people would do the right thing, others would not, and we know who they are.
Yeah, I'm not suggesting any judgment about right or wrong. I'm just pointing out that we've only gone one direction that I've ever seen, which is more complexity, more people, more consultants, more cost, and it just sort of drives that, chipping away at the opportunity to have an affordable outcome. One last thing I was curious about, this, without being in the middle of it, and I can see some downfalls here, but have you guys done any kind of lean process to think through how to try to map out the permitting process to reduce the amount of effort necessary for the team, for the staff? I mean, lots of people use poll planning and doing all those kinds of things, and a couple-hour session with the people in the room can be, in some cases, very valuable. I'm not sure if that's the case here, but it feels like if it's becoming more and more burdensome, maybe it's a good time to do something like that.
So in the late fall of 2023, we reached out to the state auditor's office and we asked if they would help us through a audit and a process improvement exercise with our permit system and our whole flow. And in response to Senate Bill 5290. So that was part of the work that we did leading up to process improvements that were made. It didn't go as deep as some of the stuff we're talking about. It really was focused on, review cycles and how do we line things up better and where is there opportunity for improvement. And we have implemented a lot of that, and it's been really helpful. But there are other steps in the process that we can look at. One that I am pushing right now is we're going to be meeting as a city internally in this room with all of the plan reviewers, the permit techs, the public works reviewers, all of the inspectors, the building inspectors, the public works inspectors, and we're going to be doing a review about when we intercept an applicant with an idea through when we are finishing up and final inspecting a project, and all of the things that go into the site planning exercise related to erosion control, site management, where you're going to store your materials, where deliveries are coming, site access, where people are parking, tree protection, construction limits. Because we've had a challenge where, as you have picked up on, plans are getting kind of complicated and busy with a lot of information, and it's harder and harder for the inspectors and the builders to identify, well, where exactly is, the tree protection going, where's the erosion control? Where am I supposed to put these steel beams? Where am I supposed to have my subs park when they're on site? And it's resulting in some failures. So we're going to reboot the whole thing and start from the beginning and try and figure out how to make sure that people know that these are things they need to think about when they're designing their project, and how do we help them be successful, and how do we help ourselves be successful, and so we're probably going to end up with a whole new sheet that's a site management sheet that's just going to show those things that'll be included in the deck. And then one of the things we're going to be doing is builders sometimes forget about things like erosion control and tree protection fencing. It happens. Things get moved. But our inspectors are probably going to start a process by which when someone requests an inspection for framing a shear wall or whatever it might be, that there's a note that goes back that says that when the inspector arrives on site, they're going to ask you to do a 5-minute elevator speech, so to speak, whatever you want to call it, where the inspector shows up and then the builder's representative is there and just does really quickly, points out, they have the site management sheet, and they point out all of the things they're doing to comply with the site management sheet. And if they don't pass that, we're not going to do the inspection. So we're really trying to clean up construction. We've had some misfires. We're working on it. And what I don't want to see are problems in communities or neighborhoods where a construction site just goes in and just creates chaos in that neighborhood. I know construction's dirty, it's dusty, it's messy, but there are ways to manage it that we have builders that very successfully do it. We have other builders that it seems to be an abstract concept for them.
Okay. That's all I had. Anybody else? Syed?
David, when you started talking about the permit process, you went through the type 1 and type 2. And then you mentioned about the appeal process. Let's give it an example. Let's say I want to build a gazebo. What type is that? Is that type 1, type 2?
Type 1.
Okay. And then the appeal process, you said that's going to go through the judicial process if I want to appeal it?
Superior Court. It's a Land Use Petition Act, yep.
If I don't like the responses that I'm getting from the city, my choices would be go through the legal process?
Or a neighbor doesn't like the permit that the city issued or the project that you're proposing, then they could appeal it. More likely it's the neighbor that would appeal it or somebody who doesn't like it.
How often that happens?
Those we get about once a year that goes through the LUPA process.
You mentioned about long subdivision. Can you define that? What is long subdivision?
Yeah, so state law is kind of wonky on this. There are two types of subdivision processes under state law. Well, now there's a third, the unit lot division. That's a whole other thing. But the traditional form is a short subdivision and there's a flexible threshold that the state law offers. And it's, for us, it's 9 or fewer lots is considered a short subdivision, and it doesn't require a hearing with the hearing examiner, and it's easier process to get through. The standards are still the same. There isn't much different in what's being built in the end, except that the 10 or more is considered a long subdivision, and it requires that it goes through the hearing examiner. So there's a staff recommendation to the hearing examiner. Hearing examiner holds a hearing, collects feedback from the public, and then ultimately issues a decision based on the record. That they then go do all the work. If you recall, I went on kind of a long explanation of the subdivision process a few meetings ago. You might not have been here at that meeting. I can't recall. Anyway, the city council ultimately ends up ceremonially approving the final subdivision for long subdivisions. That's something we've been talking about changing, is moving it to the hearing examiner.
Definition of variance would not apply, I'm assuming, to zoning or density, right? Nobody can appeal that, use the variance as a way of asking for changing the zoning.
No, and that's part of the limitation that's listed in the code, exactly.
What else would be if it is not zoning and if it is not density? What would be an example of the variance?
Well, so zoning would be for a use. The zoning dimensional standards are what exactly would be subject to a variance. So let's say that the setbacks, the front yard setback that applies to a project would render, because of the configuration of the property and because of the location and situation of the property in the neighborhood, would make it practically unbuildable to achieve building a reasonable home that anybody else in the neighborhood would expect to build. Well, then you would probably be eligible for a grant of relief, the minimum necessary. So maybe you would take the 20-foot front yard setback to 15 feet. That might be the kind of thing that a variance would do.
Also, John asked a question about that, the staff timing. How often do you update that?
The staff.
For the review process, right, the charges.
We do that generally every year. We did not do it this year because we were going through a major overhaul of our financial system that some people know about. So yeah, we're redoing how we track costs. We have a whole new system that the city is implementing. So we held off on updating the permit fees this year while we go through that, and then once we're on the other side of that, we're going to update them.
And the last question, when we were talking about a development project during the construction, who is responsible to determine the property line?
It is the property owner.
Feud between the two, and say, hey, this is not your property is in here. Who is that? The city is responsible to kind of define it, or the applicant?
No, it's up to the private property owners, and usually they do that through hiring a Washington State licensed surveyor. And
is that a part of the permit process?
It depends. It depends on how close you're building to the setback. If you're building right up to the setback, then we do require that you identify the property boundaries and have a letter before the forms are typically before forms are put in, that verifies that the forms are in the right place, because what we don't want to do is have foundations poured that are too close to the property line. We also require that when you're framing and you get to the framing out of the trusses, that you have a surveyor provide a letter. If you're pushing up to the 35-foot height limit, that a surveyor provide a letter, a stamp by that surveyor indicating that you're within the 35-foot height limit based on their survey of the building.
And the last question, you mentioned about the public process, and you mentioned the role of the city council and the planning commission. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, the public process, the role of the planning commission and the city council. So I think the role would be hearing comments from the public, whether good or bad, about development and some of the challenges the community is facing, and identifying opportunities with staff to make improvements to codes based on work plans set by the city council. Communicating with the city council, and as individual commissioners or as a commission, you're always free to reach out to city council members and talk about things you're hearing or seeing. You know, maybe you see something in the community that is of concern to you and you would like it to be added to the work plan for the city. Well, then that would be something to take up with the staff. You could ask me about that, and I would talk to the city manager about that, or you could ask the city council, as ultimately it's the work plan that they give us and that they budget for, right? So between the city manager and the city council, the work plan is set. And
looking at it the other way around, I was looking from the applicant point of view. Is that means that if the applicant has any problem with the process that the city is going through, that can he or she bring that matter to the city council attention or the planning commission for as a complaint, as a concern?
It's an administrative function of the city, so they could bring it to your attention and make you aware of it, but really at the end of the day, that is a function that the city manager is responsible for and for implementing. So the commission doesn't have the ability to say, and you do sometimes get emails, and I try, and Evan and others and Matt try really hard to respond to those. But if you received an email for somebody who was unhappy about something or wanted something to be different, the way to take that on would be to direct that back to staff to address. And if you thought that there should be a policy change or a regulatory change, which is within the purview of the city council and the planning commission, that you could then ask that that be added to the work plan. Ultimately, it's up to the city council and the city manager to add that to the work plan and budget for it.
We're talking about a permit process.
Permit process is even a little, deeper. That is something that's set up. If you have ideas about improvements, we're all ears. We're always trying to improve.
I'm talking about from the applicant point of view. If that person has a problem with the process that the city goes through that, can that person bring the matter to the attention to the council? And how often that happens?
It's an administrative function of the city.
Administrative function.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, thanks, David.
Thank you.
Anything else from you for this evening?
Well, I just wanted to highlight that, as I mentioned, we have been hearing about the affordable housing in lieu fee and the affordable housing inclusionary requirement, and we will be bringing that back for additional conversation. We talked about it a few weeks ago. We're bringing it back on April 17th, so in 2 weeks, and wanting to have a conversation about that along with other cleanup changes from our comp plan implementing development regs that went into effect. So I think that, some of the considerations in the council asked us to bring back specifically the exemption for the in lieu fee, and just wanting to think about what you would want to include. I know that you did, as a commission, submit 3 recommendations to the council. They did debate those at length during their review of the affordable housing requirements, not only in the fall in December, November and December at those meetings, but also when they reviewed the actual fee formula itself in January and February. And I think where they landed was the 1,000 square foot exemption might be too low. There was a question about, can we raise it to 1,500 square feet? That number is in response to a letter from master builders. And I think the question for the commission is, is it appropriate to raise it to 1,500? Would you recommend 2,000? I do know that there was expression from the commission about trying to find a way to possibly exempt existing property owners who want to build a single family home. There are challenges with that as we see it. And, we think that, if you want to talk about that again and make that recommendation again, that would be something that might be worth considering and sending back to the city council. At the end of the day, we're really trying to find the right size. We also note that there is an impact that single family construction has on people's choices about what they're going to build. So we'll go into more detail about this, but I'll leave this with you for thought, is that trying to find the right combination of middle housing allowances, ADU allowances, and exemptions can really bring down the level of fee to almost nothing. If you raised it to, say, for example, to 2,000 square feet, and someone was to build a 2,000 square foot primary unit with a 1,000 square foot ADU, they would not be paying a fee. If they wanted to build 2,000 square foot primary units, they would not be paying a fee. If you raise it to 1,500, similarly, 1,500 square foot units, they would not be paying a fee. So it's really trying to find that right fit. We think that it is really challenging for us to administer it in a way where it is somebody who owns the property is building the house. We've had that challenge with shoreline permitting. We had one applicant, we have one property owner who owns quite a bit of property in the city who has been through shoreline variances and reasonable use exceptions and always claims he's building it for himself and then immediately sells it the minute it's permitted. So it's it's not quite that easy to regulate it that way.
Yeah, I have some very strong opinions about that. Unfortunately, I am unable to be here on the 17th, so we'll figure out that. Anything else?
That's it for now.
Okay. Long-term calendar is on there. Please take a look. Anything else from anybody else?
Can we change the discussion of that topic on the day you are here?
I'm not that important.
just, we would be happy to, if you have time to, meet for half an hour, 45 minutes and collect your comments, and then relay those back to the commission. I think, at a minimum, that would be appreciated. If we could do that, that'd be appreciated.
Yeah, I'm not going to be any place that I would be on Zoom. No, farther away. Okay, if that's it, then could someone move to adjourn? It's been moved and seconded that we adjourn. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.